Judge Kenneth Harper leaned back in his chair, a smug grin stretching across his face as he eyed Lisa Morgan from the bench. He had ruled over this courtroom for years, treating it like his personal domain, and no one had ever dared to challenge him. His voice dripped with condescension as he smirked. "You people never learn, do you?" The words hung in the air like a slap, silencing the murmurs in the packed courtroom. Lisa didn't flinch. She didn't let the insult show on her face. Instead, she exhaled slowly, glancing at her watch. 7 minutes. That was all it would take. Harper thought he was untouchable, convinced that his power was absolute, but he had no idea that his time was almost up. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more shocking real-life justice stories. Lisa Morgan lowered her wrist after checking her watch, her expression unreadable. Across the room, Judge Kenneth Harper still wore his smug grin, lounging back in his chair as if he owned the entire courtroom. For years, he had ruled from the bench like a dictator, making decisions based on personal biases rather than justice. His favoritism toward certain defendants, his condescending treatment of minority attorneys, and his outright dismissal of key evidence had made him untouchable. Or so he thought. Today, he had chosen to humiliate Lisa, believing she was just another lawyer who would bow under his authority. What he didn't know was that his time was running out. Lisa had spent her career dismantling men like him, exposing corruption and forcing accountability where others feared to tread. She wasn't here just for her client. She was here for something bigger. She had walked into this courtroom knowing exactly what would unfold, and as she glanced at her watch again, she knew she only had 5 minutes left before everything changed. The spectators in the courtroom had seen this scene play out before. Harper bullying attorneys, dismissing objections without consideration, ruling unfairly simply because he could. Some had learned to expect it, their silence conditioned by years of watching power go unchecked. Others, however, leaned forward in their seats, sensing something different about today. The bailiff, James Carter, stood near the bench, his arms crossed. His job had always been simple: enforce Harper's rulings, maintain order, follow commands. But even he felt the shift in the air. Something about Lisa's composure, the way she refused to react to Harper's insults, made him uneasy. He had seen lawyers shrink under the judge's arrogance, but Lisa? She hadn't flinched. She was waiting. Seated at the court clerk's desk, Michelle Dawson kept her head down, but her fingers were tense against the keyboard. She had worked under Harper for years, documenting his rulings, watching him bend the law whenever it suited him. What the judge didn't know was that Michelle had been collecting something far more valuable: evidence. A paper trail of every suspicious ruling, every questionable dismissal, and every case where justice had been obstructed. And today, all of it was about to come crashing down on him. Lisa remained calm, adjusting the papers in front of her with deliberate care. She could feel Harper waiting for her to react, hoping for a flash of anger or a moment of weakness. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The real power in the room wasn't in his gavel. It was in what was coming. Harper tapped his gavel lightly, his tone dripping with condescension. "Well, Miss Morgan, do you have anything useful to add, or are we done wasting the court's time?" He was already prepared to dismiss her, already anticipating another moment where he would assert his dominance. Lisa finally looked up and met his gaze, smiling slightly. "Actually, Your Honor, I do." She reached for a folder, flipping it open with the kind of patience that made even the spectators uneasy. Harper's smirk faltered, just for a second. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she moved felt different. The whispers in the room grew louder. People weren't just watching a lawyer defend a case anymore. They were watching a battle unfold. Harper narrowed his eyes, straightening in his chair. What's this? Another weak argument? Another desperate plea? He chuckled dryly. You people never learn. Lisa ignored his taunt. Instead, she calmly slid a single document across the desk. Harper hesitated before grabbing it. The moment his eyes scanned the first line, his face lost all color. His hands gripped the paper a little tighter as he read further, his smirk vanishing completely. Lisa exhaled softly, watching him crumble in real time. 4 minutes left. Judge Kenneth Harper's fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the document tighter, his once confident smirk now nowhere to be found. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, the weight of Lisa Morgan's words pressing down like an inescapable force. Spectators leaned forward, sensing a shift in power they had never witnessed in this room before. Harper had spent years ruling from the bench as though he were above the law, but now, for the first time, he was the one being judged. Lisa sat poised, unmoved by his growing panic. She had spent too many years watching men like Harper abuse their authority, mistaking their power for invincibility. The truth was, power only lasted as long as people allowed it to, and today his time had run out. She let him process the reality of the situation before tapping her fingers lightly on the desk, her voice calm yet sharp as a blade. Your Honor, if you need more time to process what you're reading, I understand. After all, it's not every day a judge gets to see his own corruption laid out so clearly. Harper's eyes snapped up, his face twisting with anger. You're out of line, Ms. Morgan, he barked, though his voice wavered slightly, betraying his nerves. Lisa didn't flinch. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing that's out of line is your blatant disregard for the law. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. People were no longer afraid to react, no longer afraid to acknowledge what was happening right in front of them. Harper slammed his gavel down, desperate to regain control. Enough! I will not allow you to turn my courtroom into a circus. But his words lacked their usual authority, his composure cracking with each passing second. Lisa leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make the moment feel even heavier. This isn't your courtroom anymore, Judge, and it never was. This courtroom belongs to justice. And today, for the first time in a long time, justice is finally being served. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating. Harper opened his mouth to argue, but Lisa reached for a second document before he could speak. She slid it across the desk with precise, deliberate movement. Since you seem to be struggling with the first report, let me simplify things for you, she said, her tone unwavering. This is a sworn affidavit from Court Clerk Michelle Dawson detailing years of your misconduct. You've dismissed evidence, tampered with rulings, and accepted bribes in exchange for favorable outcomes. Harper's hands balled into fists, his breathing shallow. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. Lisa continued, her voice steady, letting each word hit like a gavel striking a bench. We have witness statements, bank records, case files that mysteriously disappeared after landing on your desk. The Department of Justice has been investigating you for months, Your Honor, and in about 3 minutes, they'll be walking through that door with an arrest warrant. The courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs. People exchanged glances, eyes widening with shock. Harper, the man who had ruled with unchecked power, looked over his shoulder toward the entrance, as if somehow hoping this was a bluff. But he knew better. Lisa wasn't bluffing. The bailiff, James Carter, stood motionless by the judge's bench, his usual rigid stance now uncertain. For years he had followed Harper's commands without question. Now he was realizing he had been protecting a criminal in a robe. Lisa glanced at her watch again. 2 minutes left. Harper finally lost control. He shot up from his seat, slamming his palms onto the desk. "I will not be humiliated in my own court." His voice was raw, desperate, laced with panic. "This is nonsense. You have no real evidence, just the word of a bitter attorney who lost a case." Lisa smiled slightly, tilting her head. "Oh, Judge, if you really believe that, then you won't mind waiting for the U.S. Marshals to come in and verify it themselves." The room fell silent. Harper's gaze darted to the bailiff, his expression shifting from rage to pleading. "Carter, remove her from this courtroom immediately. She's in contempt." The bailiff hesitated. Lisa turned to him, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Carter, if I were you, I wouldn't follow that order. Because aiding and abetting a corrupt judge, that could land you in trouble too." The courtroom held its breath. Carter's fingers twitched, his muscles tense, but he didn't move. He didn't reach for Lisa, didn't make a single motion to enforce Harper's demand. Harper's breathing became labored. He was losing control, and he knew it. Lisa picked up one final document and set it on the desk in front of him. "This is your resignation letter. You can sign it now, or you can sign it after you're in handcuffs. Either way, you won't be sitting on that bench much longer." Harper stared at the paper, his entire world collapsing. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The gavel in his hand, once a symbol of his absolute power, now felt useless. He had spent years deciding the fate of others. Now, his own fate was being sealed. Then, the doors burst open. Gasps filled the courtroom as U.S. Marshals stepped inside, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Harper turned ghostly pale, his knees nearly buckling. Lisa leaned back in her chair, calm and composed, as she watched justice walk through the door. "Right on time," she said. The courtroom door swung open with force, and the presence of U.S. Marshals in full uniform sent a shockwave through the room. The air grew thick with tension, eyes darting between the officers and Judge Kenneth Harper, who stood frozen in disbelief. His gavel, the very tool he had used to assert dominance over this courtroom for years, now lay forgotten on his desk. He blinked rapidly, his face losing what little color remained as reality crashed down upon him. Lisa Morgan remained seated, calm and composed, watching him unravel. She had seen men like him before, men who believed power was something they owned rather than something they borrowed. And now, as Harper's grip on that power slipped through his fingers, his expression was one of sheer terror. The lead marshal, a broad-shouldered man with an authoritative presence, stepped forward and spoke in a clipped, professional tone. "Judge Kenneth Harper, by order of the United States Department of Justice, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of judicial misconduct." The courtroom erupted into gasps, whispers, and murmurs of disbelief, though not a single soul stepped forward to defend Harper. Harper staggered backward, his hands gripping the bench as if the wood itself could save him. His breath came in short bursts. This is outrageous," he bellowed, his voice cracking. He turned to the bailiff, desperation clawing at his throat. "Carter, I am your judge, and I am ordering you to remove these men from my courtroom." James Carter didn't move. For the first time, he wasn't taking orders from Harper. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and for a moment, he simply looked at the man he had served under for years. Then, without a word, He took a single step back, distancing himself from the judge. The message was clear. Harper was on his own. Lisa leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dangerously smooth, "I'd suggest you comply." "Resisting arrest? That'll only make this worse for you." Harper's chest heaved, sweat glistening on his forehead as he spun toward Lisa, with unfiltered hatred in his eyes. "You," he spat. "You did this. You think you're so smart, don't you?" Lisa didn't flinch. "No, Judge Harper, I don't think I'm smart. I think I know the law, something you've spent years abusing." Harper shook his head wildly, his hands clenched into fists. He turned back to the marshals. "You can't do this to me. I am a sitting judge." The lead marshal didn't blink. "And you have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." Before Harper could react, one of the marshals grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. A loud click echoed through the silent courtroom as the cold bite of steel handcuffs locked around his wrists. The spectators who had once feared him now watched with wide eyes, some in shock, others in satisfaction. The room, which had been his kingdom for so long, had now turned into the place of his downfall. Lisa stood, slowly gathering her documents. "Funny, isn't it?" she mused. "All those years of sentencing people without a second thought. And now you're the one standing in shackles." Harper struggled against the cuffs, his face red with fury. "This isn't over," he roared, his voice cracking. "You hear me, Morgan? You'll regret this. You'll regret—" The marshal beside him tightened his grip. "That's enough," he said firmly, guiding Harper toward the door. Lisa watched, her face impassive, as Harper was led down from the bench like a common criminal. The same way he had ordered so many before him to be taken away, he now walked the same humiliating path. His tailored robes bunched awkwardly around his wrists, his expensive shoes dragging against the floor as he fought against the inevitable. The marshals stopped at the doorway, giving him one last chance to leave with dignity. But Harper, true to form, refused to go quietly. "I'll have you all fired for this. I have friends in high places." His head whipped toward the spectators, searching for allies. "I built this courtroom. I controlled everything here." Lisa exhaled and shook her head. "Not anymore." Harper was dragged out of the room, his final shouts muffled as the heavy doors closed behind him. The silence that followed was eerie, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the absence of his presence. A few moments later, Lisa turned back to the courtroom. She met the gaze of Michelle Dawson, the court clerk, who had helped gather the evidence that led to this moment. A silent nod of acknowledgement passed between them. James Carter, still standing near the bench, let out a slow breath. Then, without saying a word, he reached toward Harper's desk, grabbed the judge's gavel, and placed it carefully on the table in front of Lisa. A symbol, a passing of authority. Lisa glanced down at it, then back at Carter. She smiled. "I don't need that," she said, picking up her briefcase. "Justice doesn't come from a gavel. It comes from the people who demand it." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving behind a courtroom that would never be the same again. As Lisa Morgan stepped out of the courthouse, the air around her felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had just unfolded inside. The echoes of Judge Kenneth Harper's desperate shouts had faded, replaced by hushed whispers and hurried footsteps of reporters eager to break the story. The once powerful judge, feared and untouchable for years, was now in handcuffs, stripped of his authority, exposed for his corruption. But Lisa knew this wasn't just about Harper. It was about something much bigger, a system that had allowed men like him to rule unchecked, to twist justice to suit their own biases, and to silence those who dared to challenge them. She walked down the courthouse steps, her posture as steady as ever, but her mind was already moving ahead. Justice had been served today, but Lisa had spent too much time in courtrooms like this one to believe the fight was over. Change didn't happen overnight, and one man's downfall didn't erase the rot that had settled deep into the foundations of the system. As she reached the sidewalk, she became aware of the crowd gathering. Some people stood frozen, their eyes filled with disbelief, while others nodded at her in silent admiration. The realization that a judge had been arrested inside his own courtroom was not something that happened every day. The hurried sound of footsteps behind her made Lisa turn slightly. Michelle Dawson, the court clerk who had been instrumental in gathering evidence against Harper, was making her way toward her, a look of both relief and hesitation on her face. The difference in Michelle was immediate. Gone was the fear, the burden of working under a corrupt official who had ruled unchecked for so long. Now she stood taller, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "You knew this would happen," Michelle said, her breath still uneven from the rush outside. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. Lisa nodded. "I did." Michelle hesitated, shifting from foot to foot before speaking again. "I worked under him for years. I watched him destroy lives with a single ruling. I saw cases dismissed before evidence was even considered. And she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I never said anything. I never did anything to stop it." Lisa studied her, letting a brief silence stretch between them before answering. "You did today." Michelle blinked in surprise, as if the words hadn't occurred to her. "You gathered the evidence," Lisa continued, her voice calm but firm. "You took the risk. You helped expose the truth. That's more than most people would have done." She tilted her head slightly. And let's be honest, Harper wasn't the only corrupt judge sitting on that bench. This was just the beginning. Michelle nodded slowly, the weight of the statement settling in. The fight wasn't over. Just then, another voice called out, "Ms. Morgan." Lisa turned to see James Carter, the bailiff, walking toward her. But something was different. His uniform was the same, but he had removed his badge, now holding it loosely in one hand. His expression was conflicted, as if he were battling something inside himself. "I wanted to say," Carter hesitated, looking at Lisa, then down at the badge in his hand. "I should have done something sooner." Lisa remained still, arms crossed. "And why didn't you?" Carter exhaled, his grip tightening around the badge. "Because when you work under people like Harper long enough, you start believing there's nothing you can do to change things. You tell yourself it's just a job, that following orders isn't the same as being guilty. But today," his voice trailed off as he looked back at the courthouse, as if seeing it in a new light. "Today, I realized that standing by and doing nothing is just as bad." Lisa let the words settle before responding. "Then do something now." Carter's eyebrows lifted slightly, caught off guard. "You don't get to undo the past," Lisa said, stepping closer. "None of us do. But you get to decide what happens next. If you really want to make things right, then don't just walk away from this. Help fix what's broken." Carter stared at her for a moment, then at the badge in his hand. He turned it over between his fingers, lost in thought. Then, slowly, he nodded. Lisa didn't need to say anything else. She had done her part. Justice had been served today, but lasting change required more than just one person fighting a battle. It required those left behind to ensure that this wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. Without another word, she adjusted her briefcase and turned away, stepping onto the busy sidewalk and disappearing into the flow of the city. There would be other courtrooms, other battles, other people like Harper who believed they were untouchable. But today, justice had won. As Lisa Morgan stepped onto the busy sidewalk, the weight of the courtroom still lingered in her thoughts. The chaos inside had finally settled, but outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. Cars passed, people walked by, some unaware, some stealing glances at the courthouse where a judge had just been arrested inside his own domain. Lisa exhaled deeply, adjusting the strap of her briefcase. She had done what needed to be done, but she knew the fight wasn't over. It never really was. Behind her, James Carter stood frozen in place, still holding his badge. He watched as Lisa disappeared into the crowd, her purpose unwavering. The words she had left him with echoed in his mind. Then do something now. For years, he had convinced himself that he was just following orders, that his role was insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But today, that illusion had been shattered. Today, he had seen what real justice looked like. He glanced down at his badge, his grip tightening before he took a slow breath and turned back toward the courthouse. If Lisa Morgan could fight for justice without fear, maybe it was time he stopped being afraid too. Inside the courthouse, the energy was completely different. The once intimidating chambers where Judge Harper had ruled with unchecked power felt smaller now, as if his very presence had been holding up the walls. Reporters swarmed the hallways, cameras flashing as they captured the aftermath of one of the biggest judicial scandals the state had ever seen. Michelle Dawson sat at her desk, watching it all unfold. She had spent years documenting every corrupt decision, every unethical ruling, every moment Harper had abused his power. And now she was finally free of him. But as she watched the scene before her, she realized something. One corrupt judge removed didn't mean the system was clean. There were others like Harper, other judges who had ruled unfairly without consequence. Taking a deep breath, Michelle made a decision. She picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and pressed call. The person on the other end answered almost immediately. "I have something you might be interested in," she said, her voice steady. "More than just Harper. There are others, and I have the documents to prove it." She listened for a moment before nodding. "Yes, I'm ready to testify." Lisa, unaware of Michelle's decision, continued walking down the street, her mind already preparing for the next battle. She knew this wasn't the last corrupt official she'd have to expose. The fight for justice never ended. It only shifted to new battlefields. The system was broken, but today had proven that it could still be held accountable. And as long as there were people willing to fight for what was right, there was always hope. She turned a corner and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her emails. As expected, news of Harper's arrest was already making headlines. Corrupt judge arrested in his own courtroom. Justice served as federal agents take down unethical judge. Lisa Morgan exposes systemic corruption. She sighed, shaking her head slightly. The media would turn this into a spectacle. But she knew the real work happened outside the headlines. People would celebrate Harper's downfall, but how many would continue demanding accountability when the cameras turned away? Her thoughts were interrupted by an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, a federal investigator she had worked with in the past. She answered, "Morgan, we need to talk," the voice on the other end said. "Harper isn't the only one. There's more." And you're going to want to see this. Lisa nodded to herself. I'm listening. As she continued walking, the city moving around her, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As Lisa Morgan walked down the busy street, the courthouse fading behind her, she gripped her phone a little tighter. The voice on the other end had just confirmed what she already suspected. Harper was only the beginning. His arrest would make headlines, stir public outrage, maybe even spark change, but real justice. That required more than taking down one corrupt judge. The system was still broken, and there were more like him, hidden in plain sight, protected by power and secrecy. She exhaled, her pace steady. The call had ended, but the weight of its message lingered. People would talk about today, celebrate Harper's downfall, but would they keep paying attention? Would they demand justice beyond this one moment? Lisa knew the truth. Change didn't happen because of one case. It happened when people refused to stay silent, when they kept fighting even after the cameras turned away. She glanced at the news notifications flooding her phone, the headlines sensationalizing the courtroom drama. Racist judge gets what he deserves. Corrupt official exposed by powerhouse attorney. She shook her head. The story would trend for a while, but what happened next was what really mattered. Would people remember? Would they care when the next Harper sat behind the bench, quietly bending the law to his will? Lisa stopped at the curb, looking ahead at the city sprawling before her. This wasn't the end. This was just another beginning. What do you think? Should more corrupt officials be exposed? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories.